Sup boys? So Kazuha may actually be one of the more interesting additions that we've had in the game for a while. This kind of stems from the fact that in 1.6 we had the buffs to the transformative reactions and the fact that he carries an animo vision with him. He can add some serious damage to a team if you utilize him correctly. So we're actually going to be talking about two separate builds that you can do for him to keep him at his fullest potential. The first one is we're going to talk about kind of like a sub-DPS, sort of kind of like a battery or a burst support, kind of depending on which way you lean. And then we'll actually talk about going full-blown elemental mastery support. Do note that you could actually mix both of these options as kind of to make a hybrid Kazuha, and you can essentially just choose a weapon that falls more in line with whatever role you want to play, and then just decide on the main stats of your artifacts. Some people have even started to name these specific builds like mono EM or duo EM for however many, artifacts you have dedicated to elemental mastery. And last thing of note before we get started, I did actually update the move value spreadsheet. So this spreadsheet, which we've detailed plenty in previous videos, essentially I've updated it to include Kazuha and all of his move values. I actually changed it to make sure that it fell in line with plunge attacks and hold skills and stuff like that. And you can, check this out in the description if you're interested. His move values are actually pretty decent. I mean, you can see directly compared to Traveler in the spreadsheet right now, but typically Kazuha is not like super main carry status. He's basically going to be used as more of a supporting role than a main carry, so that's kind of hence the two options that we're going to talk about today. So as a sub-DPS, your main use for Kazuha is to add him into a team where his skill and his burst will add as much damage as possible while not taking up too much on field time. The main reason for this is simply like we talked about, because his multipliers aren't really up to par with other on-field carries. You can kind of think of this as sort of like a burst support or a battery, depending on which side you want to stand on. Burst or battery, you can kind of choose your weapons accordingly. As a burst support, you may want to lean into a weapon that has more energy recharge, and conversely, as a battery, you may want to lean into something that generates more energy. So if you take a look at this chart that I've made, these are all listed in terms of their overall DPS. If you just want to disregard everything in terms of sub-DPS or elemental support, you can just stick Primordial Jade Cutter, Summit Shaper, Aquila Favonia, whatever you want to do. Stick one of those three on him and make him a main carry. It completely works, but you're missing out on a lot of the benefits that he provides to the overall team DPS rather than just solo main carry DPS. Basically, what I would suggest is picking a weapon as high up on the list as you can that kind of corresponds to the overall goal of your Kazuha. So if you're going for burst support, maybe you want to run something like Scoured Blade, or maybe something like Festering Desire, versus if you're going for more of a battery, you might want to choose something like Sacrificial Sword or Favonius Sword. As you can imagine, as an animo character, Veritas and Veneer is pretty much top contender for the set of artifacts that we want to use. As a sub DPS though, you could argue a couple of different combinations outside of Veritas and Veneer. So you could do a 2-piece Veritas and Veneer and a 2-piece Gladiator for extra attack percent, a 2-piece Veritas and Veneer and a 2-piece Noblest for extra burst damage. Those are probably the most prominent sets, but of course there are multiple other options for different niche builds, like Gamblers for extra skill damage, or Thundering Fury and Lava Walker for teams that kind of deal those respective damages can also kind of work. If you did end up choosing an energy recharge percent weapon, you typically would want to go with attack percent for your timepiece. Otherwise, if you feel like you aren't able to keep your burst off of cooldown, you could opt for the energy recharge timepiece. Just know that you will literally neuter your total damage if you do that. Animo percent on the goblet and crit percent on the circlet is usually the best thing to do. Substats are pretty cut and dry as well. Any kind of crit percents, attack percents, energy recharge. Elemental mastery is kind of perfect on Kazuha, and it actually becomes increasingly favored depending on how reliant your team is on reaction-based damage. As for your talents, you typically don't really have a reason to increase your normal attack unless you want Kazuha to spend more on field time. Depending on which direction you're leaning between burst or battery, you'd want to increase your burst or skill respectively. Obviously, if you're going to be using your burst more often as a burst support, it makes more sense to increase that, versus if you're using him to generate energy particles and just using his skill as often as possible, you'd obviously want to increase your skill. Now, as an elemental mastery support, you're basically giving the reaction team that you already have built their dream all-star. Kazuha's A4 passive, increasing elemental damage by 0.04% of his elemental mastery, you can kind of imagine that he can add tons of extra damage. The main bulk of this build is pumping as much elemental mastery onto Kazuha as possible. So with your weapons, as you can imagine, any weapon that has Elemental Mastery as a secondary stat is top notch here. Taking a look at the exact same chart we looked at earlier, Freedom Sworn is a top option in this build. The amount of Elemental Mastery you can get out of that sword is super duper insane. Iron Sting is kind of a free-to-play version of that and probably your second best option. And then Alley Flash is all right. It's what I've been using just because it's like the best option that I have right now. It's a great beat stick, but the elemental mastery that it provides isn't super high overall, so it's kind of not the best in terms of like elemental mastery gains, but you get what I'm saying. As for artifacts, this is going to be a little bit of your personal preference when it comes to sets. Using Kazuha in a reaction team, you can't really disregard the 4-piece Verdicent Veneer for elemental resistance shred, although that's only one of your options. Some might want to take full advantage of the elemental mastery and go with 4-piece instructor. You could also shoot for 2-piece Wondrous Troop and 2-piece instructors, and honestly, it's usually easier to mix two different sets, but that would ultimately be up to you. As for your main stats, you would definitely want to lean completely into elemental mastery on all your pieces. You should be able to get reliably somewhere north of 800 elemental mastery just from your main stats, your weapon, and your ascension gains. With your flower and feather, try to lean into as many elemental mastery substats as possible. And then speaking of substats, since you can't really get elemental mastery except for on your flower and your feather, try to go with energy recharge percent here. It makes a lot of sense. Then kind of prioritize your crit percents and your attack percents and you should be just fine. As for your talents, this one is honestly kind of dead even between the burst and the skill. It really will depend on your playstyle. If you end up having more of a quick swap oriented team, if you're constantly switching through your characters, you may want to, lean more towards your skill. But if you are kind of in a team where you have maybe a selfish carry or your main bulk of your damage comes from one single character that you don't really switch off of that often once you get into the groove that you normally do, maybe you want to go with your burst. It just really is dependent on how you want to do it. Again, normal attack isn't super important unless you're leaning into more field time with Kazuha. But again, that would also be up to how you end up playing. I personally would do my burst 99% of the time, and then I would do my skill the other times that I can't increase my burst for whatever reason. Now let's actually talk about some team ideas. So remember that he's actually competing with some serious contenders here. Both Venti and Sucrose are really good at what they do, but Kazuha can definitely add some value in certain places. A pretty common freeze comp is Ganyu, an Animo character, Mona, and Diona. Typically it's Venti in the Animo slot, but Kazuha can actually do some decent stuff. Venti usually is just flat out better when it comes to crowds though, but Kazuha actually can add a bit of value, especially a little bit more than Sucrose usually. Just be careful with your plunge attacks because they will cause shatter and you typically don't want that with Omen active. Typically you just kind of want to avoid using your skill if you're like in that like monkey brain, I gotta do my plunge attacks. While Omen is up from Mona, so you should be good. So Electro-Charged, think of something like Beto, Kazuha, Singshu, and Fischl. So it's kind of iffy because Electro-Charged overall is not the most reliable reaction out there, but the fact that it can stagger some enemies and provide some chip damage to larger enemies makes it okay. Also keep in mind that how beneficial Beto's burst and Singshu's rain screen put together can actually be. Both of those provide a huge amount of damage reduction and you can pretty much mitigate a ton of actual damage that you would normally be taking. As for an overload team, think of something like Beto, Kazuha, Fischl, and Bennett. So overload can also be kind of iffy, almost in the same vein as Electro-Charged. While it can provide good damage, it's really inconvenient on certain mobs and it can be really good on larger enemies, but that makes it even more situational than you would like a lot of times. You could build out Kazuha as a main carry on this team though, giving him some cheeky artifact sets like Thundering Fury and a weapon to kind of match it, like maybe Lion's Roar, and it becomes even better if you already have C6 your Bennett as well. Melt teams, so this one is kind of a big one. A lot of people are talking about how Kazuha being added to the Melt team. Typically you would run Ganyu, Sucrose, Zhangling, and Bennett on this team, but Kazuha can actually replace Zhangling simply because Zhangling, her burst is so expensive and it makes it a little bit more consistent just to put Kazuha in her place. And it makes a huge difference because this team can make great use of Verdicent Veneer while Bennett applies the Pyro to the burst so that Kazuha can swirl that burst and make Ganyu literally just melt everything. it's really, really good. As for Vaporize, my favorite one, but there's several different combinations here. I like Child, Kazuha, Xiangling, and Bennett. You could also, if you do have Hu Tao, you could replace Xiangling with Hu Tao, which is usually what I like to do. But you could also run Diluc and Xingqiu or Klee and Xingqiu instead of Child and Xiangling. Basically, Kazuha and Bennett, again, here just swirling into Pyro so that you can end up vaporizing with either Xingqiu or Child. Makes it really good. Lastly, the mono element team. So typically this would just be Kazuha plus 3 different same element characters, or you could run Kazuha and another Animo character and then 2 of the same elemental characters. It doesn't really matter kind of how you set it up. The main bulk of your damage is just going to be one specific element though. You're never going to try to do like a bunch of crazy reactions or anything. Your main goal is just like to only output pyro damage, for instance. In certain situations, this can actually be extremely effective, and it kind of allows you to bring in some more cheeky sets like we were talking about with like Thundering Fury or Lava Walker, stuff like that. You can actually set up Kazuha to be a really strong main carry in a mono element team, even though he doesn't really apply those elements, but keeping the elements on the enemy is kind of what's important here, and he's really good at doing that. So that is actually pretty much going to be it for Kazuha, guys. He is super fun to play. I have noticed I have the most fun playing Animo characters out of any of the other characters on the game. I don't know why. I have a lot of fun like just utilizing an Animo character. They're always like super like fast and kind of swift and bouncing around and double jumping and stuff like that. Like that stuff is just super cool. But anyways, hopefully if you just got Kazuha and you haven't quite built him yet, or if you're looking for some builds, hopefully this helped you. If you are still on the fence about pulling for Kazuha, I kind of feel like he's not 100% needed. He's definitely great to certain team comps and certain situations, but he's not that character that is going to instantly just make your account invaluable. He's good, but he's not like a must-have. It honestly would be easy to skip this if you already are looking forward to one of the characters that they have detailed already. And we're getting ready to get, you know, the 1.7, 2.0, whatever they want to call it, live stream very soon. So we'll stick around and see what's up with that. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and head out. See you guys.